In the winter of 2022, a phone call reportedly went out from Berlin to Moscow, and the lights quite literally stayed on. For half a century, the pipelines beneath the Baltic seabed and the frozen steppe had carried something more than methane. They carried trust between adversaries, a wager that commerce could outlast ideology. But by 2022, that wager was collapsing. Reservoirs in Germany sat half empty. Factories in Italy braced for rationing. And somewhere beneath the Baltic Sea, explosions tore open steel pipes built to last a century, sending plumes of gas bubbling to the surface in an act whose author remains, to this day, unconfirmed. How did the richest, most industrialized continent on Earth become so entangled with the very nation many of its members considered their greatest strategic threat? The answer begins not in 2022, but in 1970, with a Soviet premier, a West German chancellor, and a pipe that ran through the heart of the Iron Curtain. The story of Europe's dependence on Russian gas does not begin with Vladimir Putin, nor even with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It begins in the depths of the Cold War, at a moment when Western Europe and the Soviet bloc, locked in ideological confrontation, discovered an unlikely common interest: pipe for grain and gas for hard currency. In 1970, the Soviet Union and West Germany signed what came to be known as the Pipes for Gas Agreement. West German companies, led by firms like Mannesmann and Thyssen, would supply the large-diameter steel pipes the Soviets lacked the industrial capacity to produce at scale, and in return, the USSR would deliver natural gas from its vast Siberian fields to West German consumers for decades to come. It was a strange marriage of Cold War rivals. Washington, deep in its own strategy of containment, watched with unease as its closest European ally began wiring itself directly into Soviet energy infrastructure. But West German Chancellor Willy Brandt had a different vision. His policy of Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy, held that trade and engagement, not isolation, would eventually soften the Soviet bloc, tying Moscow's economic interests to the West's and reducing the temperature of confrontation. Energy was not treated as a weapon. It was treated as an olive branch delivered through steel and compressed gas. By 1973, the first major pipeline, known as the Druzhba, or Friendship, oil pipeline network and its natural gas counterparts, had begun threading through Czechoslovakia and into Bavaria. The name was almost ironic, given the ideological gulf it crossed, but it captured the spirit of détente. Western Europe, still recovering from a 1973 Arab oil embargo and desperate to diversify away from Middle Eastern crude, saw Soviet gas as a stabilizing alternative. The Soviets, for their part, needed the hard currency that oil and gas exports could provide, especially as their centrally planned economy struggled to generate growth through other means. It was on paper mutually beneficial. Neither side anticipated how deep the entanglement would eventually become. The relationship deepened through the late 1970s and into the 1980s despite growing friction with Washington. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and again as Poland's solidarity movement faced martial law crackdown in 1981, the Reagan administration pushed hard for European allies to cancel a massive new pipeline project, the so-called Siberian or Urengoy pipeline, which would carry gas over 3,000 kilometers from the Yamal Peninsula to Western Europe. Reagan imposed sanctions on American and even foreign companies supplying turbine technology for the project, arguing that Europe was financing its own strategic vulnerability and indirectly funding Soviet military adventurism. The dispute triggered a serious rift within NATO. West Germany, France, Italy, and Britain refused to abandon contracts already signed, viewing Reagan's sanctions as an overreach into their sovereign economic decisions. Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and later Helmut Kohl held firm. Europe would build the pipeline, sanctions or not. Reagan eventually backed down in 1982, unable to sustain the transatlantic rupture the dispute was causing. The pipeline was completed, and Soviet gas exports to Western Europe expanded substantially through the 1980s. It was, in retrospect, the first major test of whether the West could resist the economic logic of cheap, plentiful Russian energy in favor of strategic caution. Economic logic won. The Soviet collapse in 1991 did not sever this relationship. It merely reorganized it. Gazprom, the state gas monopoly, emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Energy Ministry as an entity so vast and so central to the Russian state's finances that its fortunes and the Kremlin's became functionally inseparable. Meanwhile, the pipeline network that had once run entirely within Soviet borders now crossed the newly sovereign territory of Ukraine, which found itself in possession of the critical transit corridor carrying the majority of Russian gas destined for European markets. This created an immediate strategic vulnerability, though few grasped its full implications at the time. Russia needed Ukraine's pipelines to reach its most lucrative customers. Ukraine needed discounted Russian gas to fuel its own struggling post-Soviet economy, and Europe needed both countries to keep cooperating. Throughout the 1990s, as Russia endured economic collapse, hyperinflation, and the chaotic privatizations of the Yeltsin era, gas exports remained one of the few reliable sources of state revenue. Pipeline politics receded from headlines, overshadowed by more visible crises. But beneath the surface, European utilities and industrial users were steadily increasing their reliance on Russian supply, drawn by its price advantage over Norwegian, Algerian, or Middle Eastern alternatives, and by the simple convenience of an existing, functioning pipeline network already reaching deep into the continent's industrial heartlands. The turn of the millennium brought a new Russian leader and a new assertiveness. Vladimir Putin, who became president in 2000, viewed energy not merely as a commercial commodity, but as an instrument of state power, a lever that could reward friendly governments with discounted supply and punish uncooperative ones with price hikes or disruptions. The first major demonstration came in January 2006, when a pricing dispute between Gazprom and Ukraine's national gas company escalated into a full supply cutoff. Because Ukraine's pipelines were the primary conduit for gas heading to European Union member states, the disruption did not stay contained to Ukraine. Countries as far away as France and Italy reported measurable drops in gas pressure within days. The 2006 crisis was resolved within weeks, but it sent a chilling signal across European capitals. Their energy security rested not just on Russian goodwill, but on the health of an increasingly adversarial Russian-Ukrainian relationship neither side fully controlled. The warning was not heeded quickly enough. A second, far more severe crisis erupted in January 2009, again rooted in a pricing and debt dispute between Moscow and Kiev. This time, Gazprom cut all gas flowing through Ukraine for roughly 2 weeks in the depths of winter. Bulgaria, Slovakia, and parts of the Balkans experienced serious shortages, with some reports of hospitals and schools losing heating capacity. The European Union, whose energy security had until then rested on a comfortable assumption of Russian reliability, was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. An external dispute over invoices and pipeline fees, entirely outside EU control, could leave its citizens shivering in winter darkness. And yet the response, remarkably, was not retreat from Russian gas, but an effort to route around Ukraine entirely, building new pipelines that would bypass the troublesome transit state altogether. This logic produced Nord Stream 1, a pipeline running directly along the floor of the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany, bypassing Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine in one stroke. Construction began in 2010, and the pipeline became operational in 2011, doubling direct Russian gas capacity into Germany and, by extension, into the broader European market Germany served as a hub for. German leadership, particularly under Chancellor Angela Merkel, championed the project as an engineering and economic triumph, one that would insulate Western Europe from the transit disputes plaguing Ukraine while cementing Germany's role as the continent's central energy distribution point. Critics, particularly in Poland and the Baltic states, argued the pipeline was a strategic disaster in the making. It did not reduce Europe's dependence on Russian gas, they warned. It merely rerouted that dependence directly into the hands of Berlin and Moscow, sidelining the very Eastern European states most vulnerable to Russian pressure, and stripping Ukraine of transit revenue and geopolitical leverage it had used as a form of protection. These warnings were largely dismissed in Berlin as Cold War paranoia. The pipeline was, after all, just business. Then came 2014. Russia's annexation of Crimea and its support for separatist militias in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region shattered the post-Cold War security order in Europe, triggering the first significant Western sanctions regime against Moscow since the Soviet collapse. And yet, in a pattern that would repeat itself, energy trade was largely carved out from these sanctions. Gas continued to flow. European governments condemned Russian aggression in statements, while continuing to pay for Russian gas in invoices, an apparent contradiction that reflected the depth of the entanglement built up over 4 decades. Far from retreating, Gazprom and its European partners pressed forward with an even more ambitious project, Nord Stream 2, a second Baltic Sea pipeline that would double direct capacity to Germany yet again. The project ignited fierce controversy. The United States, under both the Obama and Trump administrations, warned that Nord Stream 2 would leave Europe dangerously overexposed to Russian coercion, and Washington eventually imposed sanctions targeting the companies involved in its construction. Ukraine and Poland pleaded with Berlin to abandon the project, arguing it rewarded Russian aggression with an even larger and more direct energy weapon. Germany, backed by influential figures in its business and political establishment, including former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who took a position on the board of Nord Stream's parent company after leaving office, refused to yield. Nord Stream 2 was completed in 2021, though it would never carry a single cubic meter of commercial gas. The reason was the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Within days, Germany suspended certification of Nord Stream 2, and within weeks, the European Union began the wrenching process of imagining, for the first time in half a century, a future without Russian pipeline gas. The scale of the dependency that had accumulated became starkly visible only once policymakers tried to unwind it. Germany, Europe's industrial engine, had relied on Russia for well over half of its natural gas imports in the years leading up to the invasion. Other EU states, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, depended on Russian supply for an even larger share of their consumption, in some cases nearly the entirety of it. Sanctions escalated through 2022 as evidence of atrocities in Ukrainian towns like Bucha emerged, and as the war ground into a prolonged and brutal conflict rather than the swift Russian victory many analysts had initially anticipated. Yet unwinding energy dependence proved far harder than imposing financial or trade sanctions. Gas cannot be substituted overnight. Pipelines cannot be rerouted without years of infrastructure investment, and the European winter does not wait for diplomatic resolution. Throughout the spring and summer of 2022, Russia progressively reduced gas flows to Europe, first citing technical maintenance issues on Nord Stream 1 that European officials viewed as pretextual, then cutting supply outright to numerous EU member states, framed by Moscow as retaliation for Western sanctions and military support to Ukraine. Gas prices across European wholesale markets soared to levels many times their historical average, triggering an energy affordability crisis that rippled through households and industries alike. Governments across the continent scrambled to introduce price caps, subsidies, and emergency conservation measures. Then, in September 2022, came the moment that would come to symbolize the complete rupture of the old relationship. Underwater explosions ruptured 3 of the 4 Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines beneath the Baltic Sea, releasing enormous plumes of methane to the surface in what investigators from multiple countries concluded was a deliberate act of sabotage. Responsibility for the attack has never been definitively and publicly established, and competing theories have implicated different state and non-state actors, a mystery that remains formally unresolved. Symbolically, however, the message was unmistakable. The physical infrastructure of 50 years of energy interdependence between Russia and Western Europe have been violently and irreversibly severed. What followed was one of the most rapid energy reconfigurations in modern European history. Europe turned to liquefied natural gas, shipped by tanker from the United States, Qatar, and other suppliers, building new import terminals at a pace previously thought impossible for a continent notorious for slow-moving regulatory processes. Germany, which had no LNG import infrastructure of its own before the crisis, constructed floating terminals within months rather than the years such projects typically require. Countries diversified supply contracts, expanded renewable energy investment, and in some cases extended the life of coal and even nuclear plants they had previously slated for closure, an uncomfortable reversal for governments that had built climate policy around phasing out such sources. Households across the continent adjusted consumption, turning down thermostats and shifting industrial production schedules to offset shortages. The winter of 2022 into 2023, feared by many to be catastrophic, proved milder than anticipated, and aggressive conservation combined with a relatively mild season allowed Europe to avoid the most severe blackout scenarios analysts had modeled. By the following years, Russian pipeline gas flowing directly into the European Union had collapsed to a small fraction of its pre-war volumes, with the remaining flows largely routed through Ukraine's own transit system under a contract that itself expired at the end of 2024, cutting off one of the last remaining direct pipeline routes. Europe's dependence had not vanished. It had transformed. The continent now imported greater volumes of American liquefied natural gas than it ever had of Russian pipeline supply in equivalent terms during some periods of the crisis, trading one form of external reliance for another, albeit one aligned with rather than opposed to its security interests. Energy prices remained elevated compared to pre-crisis norms, straining European industrial competitiveness against producers in regions with cheaper energy costs, a tension that continues to shape European economic and political debate. Looking back across more than 50 years, the story of Europe's dependence on Russian gas is not a story of naivety alone, though naivety played its part. It is a story of a continent that repeatedly chose economic convenience and short-term stability over long-term strategic caution, believing, as generations of policymakers from Willy Brandt to Angela Merkel believed, that commerce could be a substitute for genuine security, that a pipeline could function as a peace treaty. For decades, that wager appeared to pay off. Gas flowed, prices stayed manageable, and the Cold War itself eventually ended without the catastrophic conflict many had feared. But the wager rested on an assumption that Russian foreign policy would remain fundamentally rational and commercially minded, an assumption that the events of 2014 and especially 2022 shattered decisively. The lesson Europe drew at enormous cost was one that Cold War strategists in Washington had warned of decades earlier and been dismissed for. That critical infrastructure built with an adversary, however economically rational in the moment, can become a vulnerability precisely when it is needed least. The pipes beneath the Baltic Sea now lie ruptured and silent, monuments to an era of interdependence whose ending was violent, disorienting, and for the millions of Europeans who lived through the winters of energy crisis, deeply personal.